All right. Joining me now for a bonus Chapo interview is David Sirota of The Lever. David, I wanted to have you on to obviously talk about the disastrous train derailment in an ongoing airborne toxic event in East Palestine, Ohio. But it just so as it happens, there was another train derailment yesterday in Houston, also of a train transporting hazardous chemicals. This one killed the worker, the driver of this train. So I guess now I'm having you on to talk about the ongoing state of train derailments in America. Going back to the East Palestine, Ohio one, because it really does seem to be dropped out of the news, or at least not receiving the coverage that this warrants. David, what do we know so far about what happened and the scale of this disaster? And I'm thinking particularly to the watershed of the entire Ohio Valley.
Well, what we know is that various chemicals that are toxic, leaked into various creeks and streams around this watershed. It's still unclear what the implications of that will be in terms of whether those chemicals will wash out into the larger Ohio River and into the Mississippi River, or whether they will kind of get permanently into the groundwater. We know that there are some areas that are under, there have been some boil water advisories and the like, but I think a lot is unknown. Certainly what we know is that vinyl chloride, which is one of the main chemicals at the center of this, is a highly toxic chemical that can cause, it's a carcinogen, a very serious carcinogen. And we also know there have been widespread reports of animals and the like getting sick in the area. But I think we don't really know. And I think the EPA, we do know that the EPA has told the company, Norfolk Southern, that it should prepare to face some kind of liability for this disaster. But of course, I think that goes back to a question of, well, how did this disaster, what were the conditions created for a disaster like this to happen? I think Norfolk Southern is a rail giant that's used to not really having to be held liable in any kind of material way, in any kind of serious way when these things happen, serious enough to deter it from engaging in the kinds of business decisions that it made, whether it's understaffing the railway, whether it's not investing in the kinds of braking systems that experts have said are necessary, that they're essentially banking on the idea that they can blow up a town, pollute a whole area, and not really have to pay very much. And they know that they rely on the idea that their shareholders are going to reward them for making the kinds of cuts that they've made.
And you brought up Norfolk Southern, and in addition to the as you said, as yet unknown scale of this disaster, this is doubly infuriating because Norfolk Southern is one of the main rail companies that the Biden administration broke the rail workers strike for just the other month. And I would encourage people to go back and listen to the interview I did just a little while ago with Ross Gruters and Devin Mance of Railroad Workers United and BMW ED Teamsters, because they were talking about this is an issue about safety, not just for the people who work on railroads, but for basically any town that doesn't want several thousand tons of hydrogen chloride dumped into their water supply. How would you connect this to what the railroad workers were asking for a couple months ago and a disaster like this, which comes directly from these rail companies being allowed to skirt safety regulations and operate trains that are dangerously understaffed?
So I think it's all part of one larger story. And the story is what the rail companies want, the rail companies have been given by the government. And I think it's both a regulatory story and it's a story about the workers. So on the regulatory side, the story of the conditions that existed in the lead up to this disaster are as such. In 2014, 2015, the Obama administration, after a series of rail disasters, one, by the way, including the same chemical at issue, vinyl chloride, at issue in Ohio, the Obama administration felt the pressure to propose a rail safety rule. It was primarily focused on oil trains, crude oil trains. There had also been some oil spills from transporting crude. And the Obama administration put out a call when they were making the rule. They said, give us comments, the public, give us comments about what kind of rule that you want. And one of the commenters was the National Transportation Safety Board, which is the government agency that investigates, independently investigates accidents. And that agency said to the Obama administration, whatever rule you come up with over hazardous material trains should be broad enough to cover a broad scope of toxic chemicals, including what's known as class 2 chemicals like vinyl chloride. In other words, it shouldn't just be oil trains. It should be trains that carry all sorts of toxic chemicals. And ultimately, the chemical lobby lobbied against that broadening, and the Obama administration sided with that lobby and limited the definition of what is a high hazard flammable train, to the point where this train that you saw, if you've seen video of this giant fireball, a mushroom cloud and the like, 100-foot flames, that train was not classified as a high hazard flammable train and subjected to the tougher rules. So that's one part of the regulatory story. Subsequent to that, one of the things that did survive in the Obama rule was a mandate that at least the oil trains use what's known as ECP brakes, these better technological brakes, an upgrade from the Civil War era braking system. One former regulator told us that ECP brakes would have made a difference in this Ohio disaster. That part of the rule did survive, although it was only applied to oil trains. But the point of that was to try to get the industry to embrace these brakes industry-wide. And Donald Trump, when he came into office, he almost immediately repealed that. So you had the regulatory situation where this train wasn't classified as a high hazard flammable train, did not have these brakes on them. And then additionally, you had the government moving in to force a contract on workers who were striking in part because of the working conditions that they said were not only not economically fair, but were not creating the conditions to make effective maintenance and safety situations on the rails. So again, I think the through line is that the rail companies have gone to the government repeatedly and said, give us regulatory environments that do not mean that we have to invest adequately in safety, and help us even break a strike that is in part about workers saying that they don't have the working conditions to keep the railways safe. So the rail lobby has won over and over again. And I want to make one more point on this because I think it's so important. In an industry, in another industry where consumers could choose a different choice, you could make the argument that, okay, look, regulators aren't making the right decisions. The government's not helping the workers, but the customers can at least punish the company if you don't want to eat an unsafe product or an unsafe food or use an unsafe product. At least the deterrent is that the customers, the public, can deter the company with some sort of accountability and punishment. But when it comes to a monopoly, like a rail company, the customers, aka the shippers, they don't have a choice either, right? Like if you want to move
vinyl chloride from one part of the country to the other, you're only going to do it on rail tracks that are owned by Norfolk Southern.
Hello. Okay, which action atom was the real one? You want to do it again? Hello, and welcome to the Adam Friedland Show, the podcast. We are joined by our friend.
Oh, yeah, no. I'm going to work all day. I'm down the bars at the lunch break. Take my lunch break. Take too long on the lunch break, and then send me home on the Adam Friedland Show. Adam Friedland Show. Adam Friedland Show.
I think you fucking nailed it.
Yeah, I don't know, something like that.
I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah, you are. You little motherfucker.
There will be a video feed of this.
No, the one a couple weeks ago.
Is this the chemical spill in Ohio?
Yeah, they had to burn all the people in the train, and they were filled with chemicals, I guess. And then, no, did you see this? Have you seen the pictures of this like fucking mushroom cloud?
It's quite an impressive column of smoke billowing into the atmosphere.
Well, there's pictures from like planes where people are
you
going
can see it
over.
from planes. There's pictures of the water and around the surrounding area now.
It's funny too because it's like those people probably took those pictures from the planes like on the way to like Chicago. Like no one was going to Ohio. They're just flying over Ohio and they're like, that sucks.
And that's Ohio. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's the state with the ongoing chemical fire.
Wait, so was it a chemical fire or a passenger train?
It was a freight train.
Okay.
It was a freight train. Passengers were not killed. It was a freight train transporting
Thank God.
an extremely toxic chemical called vinyl chloride that derailed, then caught on fire, and it's a disaster, ongoing disaster.
LPs to make records.
It's like a precursor for PVC, but it's like the problem is that I guess when they keep it in a liquid state, it's like pressurized in there, but it boils at like 7 degrees. So if it loses pressure, then it immediately starts
Combusting.
boiling, and it could have created this like giant. It could have blown up the entire fucking town because basically the train turns into a bomb. So they decided to burn off the chemicals coming out of the. But then even burning it off, it's like there's like untold.
Yeah, people's pets are dying and shit.
Oh, yeah.
Birds are falling out of the sky.
Like 100 miles away.
Yeah.
And then there's already people jumping on it saying that it's part of like a Republican genocide.
Oh yeah, no, it's like a great replacement thing. They're burning down the chicken coops with all the eggs that people need, and they're intentionally derailing trains to sort of scour the landscape of people from Ohio.
Yeah, people that voted for Donald Trump.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean,
So you buy that, Will?
I think that we're going to see an uptick in train derailments. I mean, there were 1,000 last year. There'll probably be 10,000 this coming year, and just be assured that everyone who dies suspiciously in them probably wasn't vaccinated or didn't vote for Donald Trump or voted for Donald
And
Trump.
this is at the discretion of Pete Buttigieg.
Yes, he is the capo de tutti capo behind all the train derailments.
He's just kind of the power broker.
He's a madman. He's a child with a nationwide train set, and he's just like. Have you seen The Fabelmans, the Spielberg movie?
Of course I have.
Okay, it's like when little Steven.
Here we go. This is where Adam comes alive.
What are you talking about?
Like when he recreates the train disaster that he saw on screen in that movie, he's recreating it again. But like instead of being some sort of like a Freudian deconstruction of wanting to have sex with your mother or bearing witness to her dad being cucked by Seth Rogen, it's to gas Trump voters with deadly chemicals.
What's wrong with is it like something inherent in me? Like, am I just a bad person that I read about Ohio and my first thought is like, oh, I really want to watch Chernobyl again? Like, that's the emotion that it inspires.
Well, I mean, I wanted to watch Tony Scott's Unstoppable again.
Yeah.
I mean...
Great movie.
Yeah. Well, I think it's because...
is that a lack of empathy, or have I just seen too much good stuff?
I think there's just too many good movies and TV shows out these days. It's just like everything that will happen in reality already has its analog in a film or television show that's already existed and you've seen.
Yeah.
So when reality catches up to what the movie was trying to transmit, then you're like, oh, well, I have a frame of reference for this.
Literally, the Chernobyl disaster was worth it for the television series we got out of it 40 years later.
Did you know about the Ohio train disaster? They filmed parts of the White Noise adaptation in East Palestine, Ohio, and they used people from that town
also,
as extras in the train disaster.
Tough choice name choice for a town.
For a town getting bombed full of chemicals.
Right.
Israel, they'll put a settlement anywhere. Actually, that's really what's happening. It's not Trump voters. They're just clearing them out for to make an Israeli settlement in East Palestine. They got the West Bank. Now they're getting the East Bank in Ohio.
They're getting every part of it. Yeah. Adam, do you have any thoughts about that?
It's a center-left program now. So
we
are pro-Israel and pro-Palestine.
Yeah, 2 states.
Robbie, Joe Biden blew it. He had the opportunity to prove his labor-friendly pedigree to millions of workers by simply asking Congress for legislation to end the threat of a national strike on terms more favorable to workers. Sadly, he could not bring himself to advocate for a lousy handful of sick days. The Democrats and Republicans are both pawns of big business and the corporations. Don't take my word for it. That was actually a direct quote from Rail Workers United's treasurer, excerpted in a statement issued this past Tuesday. As we've covered extensively on this show, rail workers have been without a contract for almost 3 years now, as they struggle to negotiate for more than 0 sick days. That's right, they're currently at 0, unable to plan for doctor's appointments, their child's wedding, their parents' funerals, or anything at all. Despite being heralded as essential workers and valorized as classic members of the working class, the two-party duopoly is working against their efforts to secure benefits that 86% of Americans already have. How? Well, unions have power through collective action, of course, right? Unfortunately, the bargaining position held by railroad workers is artificially weakened by a 1920s-era law, the Railway Labor Act, which basically allows Congress to intervene and pass a resolution that would force workers to agree to a contract negotiated by the Biden administration rather than go on strike. Of course, the whole point of unions is that they allow workers to collectively withhold their labor power in exchange for concessions from bosses. Without a union, any one worker with a grievance can be fired or replaced. But by standing together and threatening to go on strike, workers can extract demands from their bosses by threatening the boss's ability to profit unfairly from their labor. Now, counterintuitively, the idea behind the Railway Labor Act is that because railways are so important to the economy, the government should be able to intervene to prevent a strike. But that means that railway workers are uniquely disadvantaged and vulnerable to exploitation. Think about it. If the bosses know that the government will intervene on behalf of the business industry and force labor to adhere to disadvantageous contract terms, why would bosses bargain in good faith? That's exactly what's happening. The Biden administration has been signaling that it would side against labor, and the business industry has heard those signals loud and clear. As friend of the show, Ken Klippenstein, pointed out, the CEO of the country's largest coal producers in the East confidently explained in October that, quote, "We're still believing that the federal government will be involved enough to prevent a major disruption to our economy that a rail strike would incur. So we're placing a low probability on it." To be clear, that's a coal CEO, highly reliant on rail traffic, telling his investors not to worry about a strike. Union-loving Joe Biden will put an end to it before it happens. And guess what, folks? It looks like he was right. Yesterday, by a 290 to 137 vote, the House passed legislation that would force rail workers into the tentative rail agreement that averted the strike threat back in September. Yeah, that agreement, the one with 0 sick days. Somehow, Progressive Caucus leader Pramila Jayapal and other progressives are counting this as a win. Why? Well, Jayapal simultaneously passed a bill which would secure 7 sick days for rail workers. But here's the rub. That legislation won't pass the Senate, and everybody knows it. Per the White House press secretary herself, quote, "There aren't 60 votes in the Senate for that to happen, and Biden does not support any amendment that will delay the bill getting to his desk by Saturday." Now, this framing from the White House, I gotta say, is pathologically twisted. Karine Jean-Pierre is acting as though the White House's hands are tied, while at the same time purporting to care about a worker's ability to call out sick during a pandemic. Let's be clear, if Biden wanted workers to have sick leave, he would support the workers' ability to use their strike power as a bargaining chip. Biden could say he wouldn't sign any legislation that excluded paid sick days. The government can just stay out of it if Congress can't negotiate terms favorable to workers. Instead, he's acting like he's forced to intervene on behalf of businesses and guarantee there will be no legal strike. Yes, the consequences of a strike are enormous. Without coal, power plants can't produce electricity. Water treatment plants would lack the chemicals needed to provide clean water. Grocery shelves could go empty. It could cost the economy $2 billion a day. But that's the whole point. That's why unions have leverage. The rail workers do work that is genuinely essential. So why shouldn't they get the bare minimum benefits for doing that essential work? If it's so bad for them to strike, why not pay them not to strike? Especially since railroads are making record profits. Instead of putting those profits into the businesses, those profits have gone back to shareholders in the form of nearly $200 billion in stock buybacks and dividends over the last 12 years, not into improving tracks or, God forbid, actually getting us high-speed rail so we can pretend at least to compete with China.
We've all made winter plans we never planned on missing, like Ava attending book club.
Railroad CEOs were paid over $200 million as workers suffered, per our friends at The Lever. Canadian Pacific Railway CEO Keith Creel got a 58% raise in 2021, taking home $26 million in compensation. Railroad titan Warren Buffett's net worth jumped 50% during the pandemic, but when asked about sharing the wealth, the railroad industry maintains, get this, that, quote, capital investment and risk are the reasons for their profit, not any contribution from labor. They really said that. It's corporate greed, pure and simple. Railroad companies have been cutting jobs, overworking employees, and paying themselves fat salaries. Total rail employment has dropped from over 400,000 employees in 1983 to fewer than 200,000 in 2021. Two-man crews staff 3-mile-long trains with erratic schedules and no time off. This lean staffing not only makes workers' lives miserable, it leads to derailments and delays, real costs that are already being incurred and pushed on to consumers. If there's a strike that hurts the economy, it should be clear that the fault lies with the railroad industry, not the workers. But politicians and the corporate media aren't framing it that way. Take a listen.
A rail strike is one of the most disruptive and expensive things that can happen to an economy.
A rail shutdown or strike would disrupt supply chains.
A strike means food prices could skyrocket.
Many experts are saying would be an economic catastrophe.
That could mean a big shortage and massive price hikes. Even gas prices could increase.
And it also could cost the economy $1 billion within the first week.
That would cripple the economy.
I'm not setting aside the concerns of your members, but are you and your members willing to stop the rails, in effect, and accept those costs to the U.S. economy?
Do you believe a strike is worth it if it cripples the U.S. economy and costs up to $2 billion a day?
More than $2 billion per day.
Is it worth it?
And on top of all of that, the holidays are right around the corner.
That sick framing is exemplified by this screen grab from CNN. They're clearly trying to scare viewers into rooting against a strike and for government intervention. It would impact commuters. Prices on goods would rise. Guess what? There's a simple solution to this. Give rail workers at least 7 sick days. But despite how ridiculously cut and dry this is, only 8 Democrats voted against the temporary agreement that would strip away the rail workers' bargaining power. All credit goes to Rashida Tlaib, Mark Pocan, and a few others, but most of the progressive members of the CPC and the squad fell in line, given cover by Jayapal's sick leave bill that is never going to pass the Senate. It's like how they justified bifurcating the human infrastructure bill from the hard infrastructure bill in the Build Back Better plan. Everyone could see the okie-doke from a mile away. The whole point of splitting off the social safety net provisions was to enable them to get voted down without jeopardizing the core parts of the infrastructure bill. And of course, that is exactly what happened. The sick leave amendment is completely performative. And guess what? Here's a clip of Representative Josh Gottheimer actually admitting it.
And I also think, as Mano just pointed out, we will vote separately on a paid sick leave amendment as well, and I think that's critically important. I'm hoping that moves along to the Senate and the Senate passes that. So I think we've come up with a good deal here to avert a strike, to keep the railroad running, which I think is especially important right now for our economy.
Yeah, I mean, yes, you're going to get a vote on paid sick leave. It's likely to not go anywhere in the Senate. So even if it is just a statement of you, if you will, of House Democrats, is that okay with you on paid sick leave?
Well, I think it's clear that we make that statement, and I think many of us feel strongly about that. The biggest thing is to avert a strike and avoid that. I think this deal has a lot of good things for rail workers. I've heard from many of the unions about that and the importance of their increase in pay and other benefits that will help them. And I think it's really important that they get that and that we keep, of course, the country moving, especially now.
It's important that we make that statement. Look, he just admitted. He admitted. He came out and said the biggest thing is to avert a strike. They don't give a fig about workers. They care about the business interests that keep them in Congress. Now, there has been some pushback. Most notably, Bernie Sanders has said what Biden won't. He'll refuse to vote for any legislation that doesn't include 7 days of sick leave for workers. And in the RWU press release I read at the top of this radar, they specifically praised Bernie as one of a handful of progressives among wolves in sheep's clothing who, quote, have shown their willingness to fight for us. Interestingly, Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio have also said Congress shouldn't crush unions with this rail deal and shouldn't intervene at all. And Josh Hawley, making another bid for right populism, said, quote, I will absolutely not support it without some sick leave. But Chuck Schumer reportedly already has 60 votes to pass the legislation without Bernie, Marco, Ted, or Josh, making it unclear whether this sudden Republican interest in standing with unions is sincere or performative itself. But with most progressives and squad members unwilling to even performatively stand with workers and vote down the legislation in the House, I'm inclined to give credit where credit is due. We are experiencing an unholy alliance between government and private industry, and its goal is to force workers to bend the knee to the profit motive. Monday, 400 business groups wrote Congress demanding that it intervene and prevent a strike, pointing to the apocalyptic economic consequences of not doing so. And it seems the corporate captured government, as always, is doing big businesses' bidding. Railroad monopolists have done to railways what venture capitalists have done to so many essential industries, including healthcare. Strip it bare for profit, ignoring that railways are not just the playthings of private industry, but a collective good intended to service a nation. Our rail workers deserve better, and if forced into an agreement, the public should be ready to support them in an unauthorized wildcat strike, if that's what they choose to do. Not turn against them just because a strike means your Christmas gifts might be out of stock. The best gift we can give this holiday season might just be the gift of solidarity, especially since the most union-friendly president since FDR doesn't seem to know what that word even means.
I'm just getting started, little brother. I'm coming for it all.
Covered as this sort of like act of God, inevitable, couldn't have been prevented tragedy, rather than, hey, actually industry corruption in the Obama administration, in the Trump administration, and now in the Biden administration, they're the ones that stripped out the safety regulations and the guidelines. They're the reason why this train, which was packed full of chemicals so toxic and explosive that they literally had to do this quote-unquote controlled release to avoid the whole thing blowing up like a literal bomb. This train was not classified as being highly flammable. Think about that. Think about that. That is all because of industry corruption. So this wasn't out of nowhere. This wasn't like, oh my God, we couldn't prevent it, or oh my God, you know, there was nothing we could do to mitigate the impacts here. This is a specific story of corporate corruption over years and years and years. The media has completely failed to tell that story. And so it makes it easy for people like Pete Buttigieg to, you know, do his like feigned helplessness dance, which is something Democrats tend to be really great. Oh, we'd love to do, we just can't, we're constrained, the parliamentarian, the rules, the NTSB, whatever. They always come up with a frickin' excuse. And because the media hasn't...
If those regulators can rely on the fact that something in their responsibility happens, goes badly, and they never face accountability at all. I've said this before, I'll say it again. The crazy thing is to look back on the halcyon days, I'm kidding, of course, the halcyon days of the George W. Bush administration, when a person who was running the Federal Emergency Management Agency, who did not have qualifications to run that agency, sort of very publicly dropped the ball in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And there was public demands about why was this person appointed? What are they doing? They're not doing the right job. That person felt the need, the public pressure to resign. But we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a world now where you can be the Michael Brown of the rail or the airline systems infrastructure and rely on the fact that your own party's voters are just going to see a disaster and reflexively defend you. And the problem with that, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, is the people like Pete Buttigieg can rely on that. They don't feel like they have to do anything because there's kind of a defense system, a political defense system baked in for them.
Yeah, and like in thinking about this, whether it's Pete Buttigieg, whether it's Southwest Airlines or Norfolk Southern, I mean, the thing that I'm struck by with this is that, like, if it wasn't Southwest or Norfolk, it would just be another railroad company or airline company. Because, like, I think the situation that exists is that, like, these companies are allowed to operate as essentially as monopolies or as cartels in the form of the airline industry. And, like, of course, they're allowed to run these companies in a way that maximizes profit and shows the littlest regard for human life, safety, or just, like, the consumer possible. Right. So, like, of course, Southwest Airlines, like, their system is going to shit the bed and it's going to cause a disaster during the Christmas holiday. But, like, if it was a couple years ago, it was Delta or Spirit, and, like, Norfolk, like, I'm sure, like, another company is going to, one of their trains is going to go off the tracks. And if it wasn't Secretary Buttigieg, it'd be some other stooge in his place. It's just like they each, like, in exchange for a compliant regulatory apparatus, they each have to, like, occasionally sit in the musical chair of having the public be mad at them. But essentially, like, it's not just, it's just the entire system. It's an entire apparatus that allows these companies to exist as monopolies and cartels and run their business in a way that, like, is incredibly unsafe and is only for the value of the shareholder. So, like, of course, there's going to be disasters like this, and it's just going to keep happening, and we're going to be mad at a different company or airline or Secretary of Transportation in a month or two or a year or two.